Afternoon on germane amendments. One, they write, is designed to punish Arlington Cemetery for sloppy record keeping and misburied caskets. The CQ also says that Senator Reid, the majority leader, is pushing for passage of this bill, the spending bill, tomorrow. Let's take you live now to the Senate floor here on C-SPAN 2.
Mr. Alexander.
consent that quorum call be rescinded.
Without objection, so ordered. Morning business is closed. Under the previous order, the Senate will resume consideration of H.R. 2055, which the clerk will report.
Calendar number 91, H.R. 2055, an act making appropriations for military construction, the Department of Veterans Affairs and related agencies for the fiscal year ending September 30th, 2012, and for other purposes.
Mr. President, as we begin our third day of debate on the Milcon VA Appropriations Bill, I would like to encourage my colleagues to file amendments they may have as soon as possible, as we would like to begin disposing of amendments in short order. While we are waiting, I'd like to take a few moments to talk about the VA portion of the bill. The bill totals $58.6 billion in discretionary spending for the VA in FY12. Additionally, the bill contains $52.5 billion in advance appropriations for health care for our vets. One of the few funding increases above the budget request contained in this bill is for VA medical research. As every senator knows, the unique combat situations in Afghanistan and Iraq have left many vets suffering significant injuries, including PTSD and TBI. We have a moral responsibility to take care of those who have put their lives on the line to defend our nation, and it would be short-sighted to cut funding for critical research designed to improve medical outcomes from injuries suffered on the battlefield. Over the last several years, tremendous progress has been made by the Department in reducing the number of homeless vets. According to the VA, in 2005, an estimated 195,000 vets experienced homelessness on any given night. Today, that figure is down to 75,600. Progress has been made, and this bill continues those efforts. The bill also includes funding for the VA to transform from a department heavily dependent on paper to a modern agency that leverages technology to shorten the time vets have to wait for services. The funds contained in this bill are necessary for the VA to deploy its automated claims processing system on time. There are only a few highlights of the VA title of the Milcon VA Appropriations Bill. As I have mentioned from the outset, this bill is a result of a bipartisan effort. Again, I urge my colleagues to file any amendments they may have so that we can continue to make progress in moving this bill toward final passage. I yield the floor and note the essence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
Mr. President,
Senator from South Dakota.
I ask unanimous consent that the quorum call be rescinded.
Without objection, so ordered.
I ask unanimous consent that Senator Collins be added as a co-sponsor to Amendment number 556.
Ordered.
I note an essence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
Mr. President.
The senator from Virginia.
Mr. President, first I would like to express my
we are in a quorum call.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the quorum call be vitiated.
Without objection.
Okay. Now, Mr. President, I would like to re-begin by expressing my appreciation for the remarks that the senator from South Dakota made about the need to help our veterans, and particularly those who have been serving in these recent endeavors. And I would like to express my personal appreciation once again for the service that his own son has given our country during this period, and to the service of the senator from Illinois, who's the ranking Republican on this bill, and also to my own son for having served as an enlisted Marine infantryman in Ramadi, Iraq during some of the worst fighting of that war. I rise today to discuss two amendments that Senator Warner and I have filed to this particular bill. Each relates to the Navy's proposal to home port a nuclear-powered aircraft carrier at the Naval Station Mayport in Florida by 2019. One amendment would eliminate funding of nearly $15 million for a Navy military construction project of 4-lane divided highway on the Naval Station. The Navy describes this as the first in a series of what will be increasingly expensive projects required to enable the Navy to create a second home port for aircraft carriers on the East Coast. The second amendment would eliminate approximately $15 million for architectural planning and design services for a number of follow-on military construction projects at Mayport tied, again, to carrier home porting. Mr. President, this is a slippery slope. The Navy says it will cost more than $500 million in one-time costs to home port a nuclear-powered aircraft carrier in Mayport. Other recurring costs would push the expense much higher, and in fact there are estimates that this cost could achieve more than $1 billion by the end of this decade. The reason for filing these amendments is straightforward. We owe it to the American taxpayers, and we also owe it to the integrity of our DoD budget process. The Department of Defense has been directed to achieve reductions in defense spending totaling hundreds of billions of dollars. No part of that budget should be off limits, especially a duplicative, redundant project like the Navy's carrier home porting plan for Mayport. I would like to make it clear at the outset that this is not a Virginia versus Florida issue, although there are strong political implications in both Virginia and Florida for this move. I have been involved in one way or another with the Naval Service since I was 17 years old, and I will continue to be involved in one way or another long after I am involved as a United States Senator here in the Senate. I support the Navy's requirement to sustain the naval station at Mayport in some fashion, but speaking as a former Secretary of the Navy, I'd like to point out that there are other ways to get there. I question the fiscal responsibility and the strategic necessity to home port an aircraft carrier in Mayport when less expensive home porting alternatives do exist. These amendments are directed toward necessary congressional oversight. The GAO has initiated an independent analysis of alternatives. Its assessment will be completed next spring. Before we commit to a plan to build expensive, redundant, nuclear-supported infrastructure on the East Coast with long-term spending implications, our views on the Navy's proposal should be informed by this GAO study. And let me explain my hesitations about this project. First, the Navy is proposing to expand a facility at the same time the size of its fleet is radically declined. This chart, Mr. President, shows the size of the U.S. Navy active ship force levels from 1970 until today. In 1970, the United States Navy had 743 active ships. Today, they have 284 deployable battle force ships. It's rather ironic as I stand here today because when I was Secretary of the Navy in the late 1980s, the Navy had exactly twice as many combatants as it does today, 568 combatants. It is only logical that the Navy's shore footprint should reflect this reality. the Navy's plan to build a large duplicative facility for aircraft carriers in Mayport contradicts this logic. In 1970, with 19 aircraft carriers, which is this line, Mr. President, the historical trend on aircraft carriers, the Navy homeported them in 6 locations. As the number of aircraft carriers has declined from 19 to 11 today, the number of their homeports is held fairly constant. There are now 5. So when we had 19 aircraft carriers in the Navy, they homeported them in 6 locations. Today, with 11 aircraft carriers and one, quite frankly, at risk, which I will speak to in a minute, we have 5. The Navy has upgraded its facilities at homeports on the West Coast and in Japan, as well as our East Coast homeport in Norfolk, to accommodate today's all-nuclear carrier fleet. With a fleet less than half the size of what it was in 1970, almost a third of the size of what it was in 1970, it's only logical that we don't require the same number of shore facilities to support it. And quite frankly, if I had $1 billion to spend, I think I would buy a couple ships with it and try to get the Navy up to its stated goal, which I support, of 313 combatants. There are issues of fiscal responsibility, where the Navy puts its money. Over the past 5 years, the Navy has validated unfunded requirements of more than $50 billion across its operations, military construction, modernization, and acquisition programs. I believe that is more fiscally responsible for the Navy to reduce these unfunded requirements than it would be for them to build a redundant facility. For fiscal year 08 through 12, the Navy reported unfunded priorities. These are priorities totaling $11.8 billion. Those cover shipbuilding, aircraft, procurement, aviation and ship maintenance, military construction, and other programs, all for current and future readiness needs. Their backlog in critical modernization and repair projects at the 4 naval shipyards increased to $3.5 billion in fiscal 10 as a result of inadequate investment. The Navy acknowledges that the growing risk for shipboard operations is a major concern. Overall, the Navy's shore-wide modernization backlog grew to $39.2 billion last year. Simply stated, the Navy needs to do a better job of managing its existing facilities. So, I ask my colleagues, how can we be sympathetic to Navy requests for additional funding to cover such shortfalls when it wants to put up to $1 billion in an ill-advised and duplicative carrier homeporting project in Mayport? There's been much discussion about the strategic justification, the strategic ramifications of only having 1 nuclear aircraft homeport on the East Coast. Let me talk about that. First, the Navy says that the new homeport is needed to mitigate the risk of a terrorist attack, accident, or natural disaster at the current homeporting facility in Norfolk. However, every Navy risk assessment states there is a low risk of such events occurring in the Hampton Roads region. Alternate maintenance facilities for a carrier exist at Norfolk Naval Shipyard and the private shipyard in Newport News. Last year, I supported projects at Mayport to cover this possibility as well, to dredge its channel and to modernize a pier so that a carrier could make a routine port visit there, and in the unlikely event that operations in Norfolk were interrupted, so that a carrier could use Mayport in an emergency. There has been some talk about the need for strategic dispersal. I would recognize that concept. There have been photographs of Pearl Harbor with Carrier Row, Battleship Row, and ships bunched together, and how the Japanese aircraft were able to knock them out in 1941. And there was justification for the Navy's concept of dispersal during the Cold War. But even then, many critics from GAO were faulting the Navy at a time when I was in the Pentagon for lack of a focused threat assessment to justify what some people were calling strategic homeporting, putting them in too many different locations. Today's threats are entirely different, and I would make the rather ironic note that dispersal in many ways has occurred through reduction, and I'll say this again. The United States Navy today is one-half the size it was when I was Secretary of the Navy, when it had 568 combatants. So a certain amount of dispersal has occurred by the dwindling size of the Navy. Second point is a conventional Pearl Harbor type attack is very unlikely. Secretary of Defense Panetta mentioned during his Senate confirmation hearing in June, quote, "The next Pearl Harbor that we confront could very well be a cyber attack that cripples our power systems, our grid, our security systems, our financial systems, and our governmental systems." I do not minimize the need to protect our fleet from any sort of attack. We have done an extraordinarily good job of that in the Norfolk area with high-tech defensive systems, and this is not the same type of situation when people have talked about what happened at Pearl Harbor in 1941. Another point is that less expensive home porting operations do exist. Our Navy's own studies identify other less expensive options to sustain the facility at Mayport, and I do believe that sustaining Mayport as a Navy town is very important to the interests of our country and to that region. It's an important naval base. But we have a clear responsibility to find more cost-effective, more strategically responsible ways to do that. And again, if I had $1 billion, I'd put it in 2 ships. And if I were looking for the right kind of ship to go to Mayport, Florida, I'd look for amphibs and smaller ships, so you don't have to build these highly expensive nuclear-capable facilities that, again, are redundant. So I must also note that pressures to reduce the Navy budget are getting worse. Last week, Marine Corps General James Cartwright, the Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, highlighted this challenge, saying that the Defense Department is, quote, looking at all options to reduce its budget by $400 billion in the next 10 years. General Cartwright then confirmed that the Navy was considering such options as delaying the construction of a nuclear-powered aircraft carrier or possibly canceling a future aircraft carrier acquisition. The effects of these budget pressures are manifested in the fleet today. The Navy's readiness for aviation squadrons, its surface ships have continued to decline since 2007, owing to inadequate funding for maintenance, deferred availabilities, and the fleet's high operational tempos. In their testimony on Navy readiness to the Readiness Subcommittee on the House side just last week, the Navy witnesses said, quote, "This is unsustainable over the long term." So, do we really want to spend $1 billion on a redundant home port at the expense of building ships and maintaining our fleet? I would encourage my colleagues to consider a common-sense approach and to take a year's time out before embarking on a duplicative enterprise that the Navy simply cannot afford. The service has far too many higher priorities, unfunded requirements, and readiness problems on its plate. The GAO's study will be comprehensive, it will be rigorous, and it will give us the information we need to make informed judgments next year regarding the home porting plan for Mayport. There's no cause to rush to judgment now. There's $30 million could be saved presently. As I said, this is a slippery slope that could take us down to $1 billion. We don't need it. We need the money in other areas in the Navy budget. And with that, I yield the floor and suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka. Mr. President,